I'm really pleased to see that we have so many participants, and I can also see that we do not only have participants from Europe, but also from overseas, from Australia, and possibly also from North America. I'm not quite sure about that, but very welcome to all of you. And it's a pleasure to host this meeting. This is actually the second webinar held by the European Goose Management Platform of AEWA. And as you may be aware, there's also going to be a series of webinars in the coming half year with themes around goose management, agricultural damage, and adaptive management. And they'll all be announced on the EGMP website, so keep an eye on the website when these meetings are gonna be. But today we are going to focus on crippling, and I'm going to share my screen with you. Just a second. Here we go. And we have a 2-hour program for you. We're going to start with a presentation by myself, which is sort of going to explain to you what do we mean by crippling, what are the causes and consequences of crippling, based on the experiences from the Danish Action Plan to reduce crippling that has been operating now for the last 25 years. Secondly, my colleague Kevin is going to talk about how to express crippling rates, getting into some of the methodology. Thirdly, Sander Moonen is going to talk about ongoing monitoring of crippling in geese as part of the EGMP work. And finally, Martin Gundersen from Norway is going to talk about some practical causes, how to implement the reduction of crippling in effective goose management and shooting. And we think that we have time for discussion with you for 20 minutes by the end. And if we're on time, we're also going to make a short break between the second and the third presentation, if time allows. Just some practical notes, which you may have noticed. We are recording this meeting, and it's the presentations and the clarifying questions after each talk that are going to be recorded, whereas the final discussion is not going to be recorded. And if you want to take the floor, you can use the chat, which is in the line below the screen. And please write your name and affiliation if you want to have the floor. Then we can keep track on who is asking. And then please remember to switch on your microphone when you're talking and switch it off again when you have finished. And the recording will be put on the EGMP website after a short while, and you can find the link below. So the background for this webinar is that we have now implemented 4 management plans, species action plans under the European Goose Management Platform. We started off with pink-footed geese back in 2010, and then subsequently we've had plans for tiger bean geese, barnacle geese, and grey-lag geese. And right from the start, and now throughout all the plans, crippling is raised as a major concern, and reduction of crippling is a key objective in each of these plans. We have sort of the first experience based on pink-footed geese, and now we're starting to sort of unroll some monitoring programs also for the other populations, but we are still in an early phase with regard to those. So therefore, I think it's really timely that we can share some experiences from what we've done with pink-footed geese to implement that in practice for the other plants. So I'll start off with sort of talking about what is crippling, what are the causes and consequences of crippling based on the Danish experiences. And that has had two focal species, pink-footed geese and eider ducks. And I'll certainly talk about the geese today because this is our interest in this group. First of all, I'd like to mention that this has really been a team effort among a lot of people with different expertises, wildlife ecologists. We've worked with weapon ammunition experts, statisticians, veterinarians, and social scientists throughout the program. And it has been very much an international endeavor. So the content of the presentation is that I'll briefly talk about the history of research in Denmark, then talk about the extent of crippling with focus on waterfowl, the contribution of crippling to total losses in terms of the harvest caused by hunting and the inclusion in harvest estimates in order to ensure sustainability. Then I'll talk briefly about the major causes of crippling, and then finally say a few words about the role of research in monitoring and developing management approach and achieving a change, because I think that has really been an important message from the work that we have done. So starting off with the history, I think you have to be aware that why are we actually concerned about crippling? And first of all, we have to deal with an animal welfare issue, sort of ethical issues concerning the sustainability of hunting. And if you look at the Danish Act on Hunting and Game Management, you will actually see explicitly that hunting must not cause unnecessary suffering by the game. And this also includes sort of the issues about crippling. Secondly, we also have the issue about the potential indirect mortality caused by crippling, which is additional to what is reported in the back statistics, and the sort of potential effect on population dynamics. We started off with this work back in 1990 as part of a research program. We wanted to study the pink-footed geese as a model case because we knew that pink-footed geese were mainly shot in Denmark, to a low extent also in Norway. But this was actually something that we could relate to the way hunting was performed in Denmark by that time. And we not only wanted to look at the extent of crippling, but we'd also look into the impact of the crippling at the population level. So this actually was, of course, by that time a new initiative. There had been work done on the extent of crippling in North America and in Sweden and other places before this, but this was the first time that we were addressing the actual impact of it. And we have, just for your information, two populations of pink-footed geese. We have the East Greenland Iceland breeding population that winters in the British Isles, which is close to 500,000 birds. And then we have the focal population, which is breeding in Svalbard and migrates via Norway to wintering grounds in Denmark, the Netherlands and Belgium. And more recently, we have also had a segment of the population migrating via Sweden and Finland. But this is a much smaller population, about 75 to 80,000 individuals, which has been increasing for a long time and now has been stabilizing as an effect of the adaptive harvest management program that we have been running since 2012. This population is hunted in Denmark and Norway, while it is protected in the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, and Finland. So primarily two countries are sort of concerned with the harvest and the crippling issue. We've been using X-rays primarily to study the extent of the crippling, and we've gone through sort of 3 generations of techniques for this. we started off with sort of the traditional X-raying, using pictures, which is really cumbersome and not very easy to conduct in the field. Then for a couple of years, we were using army equipment from the field hospitals, where we could actually put the birds directly under a screen, and we could take pictures directly in the field. But this was also quite tricky because this was very heavy, and it was also difficult to get hold of. Plus the fact that we would have to have an expert radiologist authorized to do the work. So for a couple of years, we have been using sort of a much more handy equipment, digital and really high resolution quality pictures can be made, and it's very easy to work with. And we have taken some courses how to operate that under safe conditions, but then we can use it ourselves without having to have expert radiologists on board in the team. So this has become much more handy. When we started this work in 1990, we were curious to see what this sort of entailed. And when we made our first publications and reports in 1996, we were actually showing that crippling was an issue of concern, not only for pink-footed geese. We found 36% of all the adults carrying shotgun pellets in the tissues. And when that was sort of published, it led to a really furious response by the Minister of Environment at that moment, who demanded that he wanted to see immediate action taken to reduce crippling. And he actually threatened the Danish hunters that if they didn't produce positive results from this, he would close the goose hunting after a couple of years. So this was taken very seriously by the Danish Wildlife Management Board and the Ministry of Environment, and in close collaboration and participation by the Danish Hunters Association, there was a National Action Plan implemented in 1997. And that included sort of immediate actions taken, raising awareness. And you see one of the posters that was made targeted pink-footed geese at that time. And we were also asked to fill some essential knowledge gaps at that time. There was a monitoring plan set up to follow up on the effect of the actions taken. And there was a series of follow-up actions that I'll come back to taken up, and that sort of led to sort of feedbacks in regulations and actual changes in the management. And that has been running since then. And the species that have been included is actually not only including pink-footed geese and eider ducks, but you see a whole list of bird species and also 3 mammal species that were included at that time. And when we then look at sort of the extent of crippling with focus on geese, so first of all, we need to sort of define what do we actually mean by crippling, and what do we actually measure when we do the X-raying, and we do that in springtime, sort of outside the hunting season. So if you imagine that hunters are shooting at geese, then there'll be 2 sort of options. Either you miss or you hit the bird. And if you hit a bird, then you'll observe maybe that it dies immediately, or you may observe or not that the individual is wounded. And in the segment of cases where birds will die, in most cases these will be retrieved by the hunter, and so will also the wounded birds that are not able to continue their flight. Some of the birds that die may not even be found again because they are difficult to find in the vegetation, and they're not retrieved. So this segment of the retrieved birds which die or are wounded and picked up again, that's what is recorded in the bag statistics. But there's another segment that is not reported and recorded in the bag statistics, and that is the so-called non-retrieved bag. And that consists of birds that are wounded, and it also consists of the birds that die and are not retrieved. And the non-retrieved wounded birds, you will have some birds which will die soon after they have been hit by the injuries. Some of them may also survive a bit longer, and some of them may actually have some crippling wounding that may cause fitness consequences in the longer term, and maybe cause them to die also in the longer term. But some of them may also survive without having any signs of crippling, but may have pellets in the tissues, or the pellets may have actually penetrated the birds, and you won't see any signs of the pellets in the birds. So the segment of the non-retrieved wounded birds are so-called serious crippling when they sort of are thought to die immediately after they have been hit, or in the short term afterwards, or in the longer term afterwards. So this is what we call serious crippling, when it has an effect, an impact on the likelihood that a bird will survive in the longer term. Then we also have the segment of light crippling, birds which are carrying pellets in the tissues, but may or may not be crippled. We can't be sure about that. And this is actually the fraction that we examine when we do the X-rays in the spring. By that time, most of the so-called serious crippled bird will have died. Some may have survived with a lower fitness in the longer term, but nevertheless, we then call them light crippling. And when we looked at sort of what happened before and after the plan was implemented in 1996, here you have the percentage of adult pink-footed geese with pellets in their tissues before the action plan was implemented, which means the birds that we had been X-raying from 1990 up to 1996, on average 36%. Then we had the action plan in 1997, and you see an immediate decline. Here we have the adults that declined by a rate of 7% per year in the subsequent 8 years. And if I'd shown the percentage of decline in the juvenile birds, which is based on a smaller sample, you see an immediate decline after the implementation of the action plan. So this was really on a good track, and the Wildlife Management Council and the Ministry of Environment were really pleased with this. This was actually a success that could be sort of was reflecting the activities under the action plan. So we were expecting this to continue actually in the subsequent years, but what we saw when we repeated the X-rays around 2010 was an increase. And this made us sort of worry a bit, what was this about? And this is actually what Kevin is going to come back to in his presentation. But when we look at sort of what levels we found by that time, we see that pink-footed geese were really high, and so were the other goose species that we examined, grey-lag geese, even barnacle geese, which were fully protected by that time. And you can also see some incidents in the other species. But what you can also see in the populations that we really monitored, we actually overall saw a decline in all of the species that we examined, from birds to mammals. So this was actually a great success. But let's look into sort of the total losses and how to include that. So we define the seriously crippled individuals and the lightly crippled individuals. Based on some field work that we did in Denmark, right around the time when the plan was implemented, we could see that in pink-footed geese, the fraction of so-called seriously crippled birds was actually 21%. It was based on a small sample, but nevertheless indicated that maybe around 1/5 of the pink-footed geese that were hit were not retrieved, but were wounded and would die soon after they had been hit. And in eiderducks, similar results showed that we had around 9% of seriously crippled birds. But we didn't at that time have a good idea about what was sort of the fate of the so-called lightly crippled birds. But we did banding of pink-footed geese right from the start, and we compared the survival of birds which were not having lead or the shotgun pellets in the tissues by the time we were x-raying versus the birds which had pellets in the tissues. And we saw a significant lower survival in birds that were carrying pellets. And we wondered what was this about, what explained that. And we thought about two alternative hypotheses. Maybe there was a long-term injury caused by the crippling that will lead to a lower survival in the birds. Or maybe there was a selective vulnerability of a certain segment. You may say, are there stupid birds that are likely to be hit more often than other birds? Or is there a segment of birds that for some other reasons are more likely to be hit than others and may be shot at repeatedly and therefore also will suffer lower survival? So that was sort of examined in the subsequent years. And first of all, we looked at sort of the body conditions of birds at the time of the X-ray. And we looked at the size of the birds and the weight of the birds and sort of made an index, a condition index out of that. And what we found here was actually that we see no effect of the number of pellets found in the tissue of birds versus the condition. So at least there was no direct sign that there would be an effect on condition that may have had fitness consequences. Of course, we could still have some subtle effects that we were not able to pick up in our measurements and in our study. Then we looked at the selective vulnerability, and this is sort of a bit of a complex story. But when we looked at the behavior of the geese out in the field, we saw that families were mostly flying around in small flocks, while non-breeding geese were actually flying around in bigger groups of birds. And the hunters who are sort of shooting geese this autumn, where we have a very low production of young in the population of pink-footed geese, will notice how they actually fly around in these big groups and are really difficult to shoot at. And when we looked at the flocks that were flying around versus the flocks that were shot at, we could actually see that there was no sort of relationship other than there was a clear sort of effect of the opportunities that hunters would have, independent on the flock size. So the line-up argument here is families primarily fly in small flocks during autumn, and hunters' shooting opportunities are largely independent of the flock size. Therefore, the risk that families and parents including the juveniles, are shot is much higher than non-breeders. And we also know from our population studies that it's a relatively small segment of the population which breeds successfully from year to year. So it's very often the same birds that are good breeders and turn up with young in the autumn. So breeding birds are probably more vulnerable to being crippled and killed. So this may actually be so that the breeding population segment of the population is actually the ones that are most exposed and at the risk of being crippled over time, and therefore also have a higher risk of being killed. So this supports this selective vulnerability hypothesis. Now we have been looking at how we can incorporate this in our population models. And those of you who are familiar with the work we do in the ETMP know that we have developed integrated population models for most of the populations now. And for the pink-footed geese, we have now included the crippling rates also in the IPM. So we are using the priors that we have these non-retrieved crippled segment, 21% based on the observations in the 1990s, and that we also have the trend in the crippling ratio of the juveniles. Kevin will explain that to you in a few minutes. But based on these two priors, we can actually sort of predict that the crippling rate of the seriously crippled birds is going down like this. From the 21% back in the 1990s to down to around 5% nowadays. There are still some assumptions that we have to deal with and work with in order to sort of really make sure that this is actually trustworthy. But this is still work that Fred Johnson, Gitte, and I are doing at the moment. But nevertheless, that indicates that there has been a change, and it may actually be also related to the action plan, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So the major causes of crippling, what are they? And we have examined in the course of our studies several factors: the use of ammunition and shotguns. This was sort of the experts on ammunition and guns who did that. We've been looking at the effect of using retrieving dogs, and that has become mandatory in Denmark since the action plan was implemented. We've been looking at the shooting skills, and we've been looking at goose shooting practices, and finally, and most importantly, we've been looking at the shooting range. We have a recommended range for geese in Denmark, which is 25 meters. For ducks, it's 30 meters. And this was actually also something that was sort of really raised in the action plan, that it was important to stick to these ranges. Back in the 1990s, we also looked at the efficiency of shooting pink-footed geese. We did that by field studies in Western Jutland, where the hunting was performed without the hunters knowing that we were observing them. So we were actually spying on the hunters at that time. And we were sitting in some elevated points so that we could look into the fields, and we could see hunters at a distance of up to 1 kilometer from the spot that we were using for observations. And we then looked at sort of what was the fate of birds that were flying over the hunters. Were the shots hitting the birds? Were the birds killed? Could we see that they downed and were retrieved by the hunters? Could we see if they were seriously crippled and not retrieved? Or could we just see that they were missed or lightly crippled? In some cases, we could see that the birds reacted to the shot, but we were not able to see if they were actually crippled or not, hit or not. So that was sort of the uncertainty that we have. We don't know if they were missed or if they were lightly crippled. But as you can see here, we categorize the shooting ranges into 10-meter intervals, and you can see a decline, sort of proportion of birds that are killed from the short shooting ranges down to 30-40 meters, and when they were shot at a range of 40 to 50 meters, hardly any birds would be killed, but potentially birds would be lightly crippled. And you can also see here in this case, seriously crippled birds were observed at the mid-range here in some instances. But at short ranges, you could see the highest success rate of 30 to 40% of birds being hit and killed. And then we also looked at the sort of the type of shooting, whether hunters were sitting out in the fields, in the ditches, or hidden camouflaged in the fields, or if the hunters were shooting at birds passing over when they were coming from the roosts. And here you can see a very clear difference that when you are in the field, you shoot at shorter ranges, whereas when you are shooting at roost flight, flying birds, you risk to shoot birds at really long distances. It's really difficult to judge the distances, and maybe hunters are inclined to take some risks that they may be able to shoot and hit a bird. But from what you can see from the upper graph here is that at those distances, the risk of crippling is really going up. So this was some of the first results that we showed, and by that time, only approximately half of the hunting parties were using retrieving dogs. And then coming to the role of research, monitoring. In the international single species management plan for the pink-footed geese, the following objective is stated and regarded essential. Ensure sustainable hunting where practiced at present in Norway and Denmark, and following wise use principles, whilst ensuring that crippling rates are kept at a minimum level. This is what is set in the plan, but everybody sort of negotiating this at that time were aware of the dilemma that at the same time it was agreed to increase the harvest rate in order to control the population size. So there may be a conflict between sort of the two objectives. You want to shoot more geese, but you want to cripple less. That sounded contradictory. But in order to sort of to find a solution to that dilemma, we actually took a series of research and management actions. From the research side, we started to work with social scientists to develop the understanding of hunters' behavior, motivations for going goose hunting, which was a basic knowledge that we needed in order to see hunters actually willing to change their behavior if needed. Then we started together with the Danish Hunters Association to engage, train hunters in effective goose shooting. This was done in a 4-year study in Denmark, and was done also in Norway as part of Gitte's PhD project, together with the Norwegian hunters. And that was done on a voluntary basis together with the hunters in Jutland and in Trøndelag. As part of that, we also developed practical tailored training courses in effective goose shooting. Ove is going to come back to that in his presentation. And we made local national dissemination of the outcomes of those initiatives. And there has also been exchange of experiences internationally within the international working group for the management plan. And what we also did, which has really been powerful, is that we engaged local ambassadors from these projects in the international working group, both in the international working groups and in the task forces, nationally and internationally, so that there would be feedback from the local experiences to the international working group, and also the other way around. And then we have been doing continued monitoring and awareness campaigns at least until 2017, and in Norway it's an ongoing process. So the recommendations that have come out of this research and the demonstration projects is sort of how can you then avoid crippling. And the most important factor that we have sort of been demonstrating is it's so important that the hunters stick to the recommended maximum shooting range of 25 meters for the geese and 30 meters for the ducks, because that reduces the risk of seriously and lightly crippled individuals. And then training and training and training, shooting and judgment of shooting range under realistic conditions. And actually in Denmark, it has become part of the proficiency test to both be able to judge correctly and to shoot at clay pigeons. And then also a very important message is to focus on shooting on geese when they come into the fields using camouflage, decoys, calls, and not shoot when the geese are passing over, because it's so difficult to judge the distances. And then, if possible, shoot in teams, because you can supplement each other. When you're out there and you see a bird is becoming crippled and flying away, maybe your teammate has a chance to give it a shot. And then choose the right ammunition and shotgun. There's a whole discussion about that and recommendations coming from that. Right. And then finally, importantly, also use a good retrieving dog, because otherwise it's really hard to find geese that are down at a long distance and in the vegetation. And then finally, about the research impact. We observed that the Danish Action Plan to reduce crippling was very successful, and it was actually a direct political and management response to the scientific evidence provided. So we are very happy to see that, of course, as a scientific community. And also the fact that the progress of the action plan has been monitored with repeated X-raying and awareness campaigns, etc. And open questions have been scientifically addressed to find solutions, and that has then had the feedback that regulations have been adjusted, there's been tailored training, proficiency tests, and recommended best practices developed. And then finally, as I started off with, the production of crippling has been included as an objective in international flyway management plans, and now it's time really to see how we can move that forward. So thank you very much for your attention, and if there's a couple of questions for clarification, we can take those now. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'll ask you for any questions. I'm sorry, this was a very information-rich presentation, but you'll have the chance, of course, to see it subsequently in the video. And if you have any interest in some of the papers that have been produced on the basis of the work, you are most welcome to contact me. I don't see any questions, or it's really hard to see. We are now 86 participants in the call, but nevertheless, so if anybody has a question, please come forward. I can see Gitte. Gitte.
No, I just wanted to say, Jesper, that there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay. Okay, please. I can see Matt Ellis from Basque in the UK. Please, Matt, take the floor.
Hi, Jesper. Good to see you again. I'm actually going to ask this one as an affiliate researcher for the Illinois Natural History Survey, which is where we've been doing the research. I'm not saying that your education program didn't work. The question is, have you considered it might be due to other things? We have similar data from Illinois, where we found that crippling rates in ducks and geese declined from about 25% in 1992 to lows of about 10% for geese and 15% for ducks around 2000, and then stabilized. And the research was originally looking at whether the transition to non-lead shot in 92 had an impact on crippling rates, and it did. It halved them. But that was in the absence of any actual training program. I don't know. I genuinely don't know what's causing it, whether it's maybe steel shot is actually better than lead shot. I'm sure the hunters will hate to hear that, but something else is clearly going on.
Thank you, Matt. I'm aware of that study. And yeah, it's a bit difficult to judge what was actually sort of going on, but nevertheless, I also know from their conclusions that there was a decline, sort of irrespectively of the change from lead to non-lead ammunition. So that was at least encouraging. Can you show me who else is asking for the floor? We still have.
I can say that William from the Netherlands also asked if X-ray device show the difference between steel pellets and lead pellets.
No, unfortunately not. That would have been nice if we could tag those, but there's not been possible for us to do that. So we have to base that on a sample of dead birds that we dissect out the shotgun pellets.
Okay, then there is a final question from Eric Kemperman that would like to respond shortly on a few topics.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Eric Kemperman. I'm the chairman of the Dutch educational system for hunters. And from that background, and my background on the screen also reveals my position. First of all, a lot of compliments for the work you did, the research you presented. I'm personally very happy with that, and there are a lot of topics and ingredients that hopefully we can work out in the future and take with us to the Netherlands to improve the quality of goose hunting and also the hunter behavior, the behavior of the hunters. Luckily, I'm also happy to see that there are topics that we already started on the community of hunters on our side, unaware of the research and your recommendations. So that brings us closer together. And for us, it is then also very important to improve or to decline crippling rates by starting at the causes, and the hunters cause crippling. That is undisputed. So I'd like to come back to you after the webinar to talk more and more in depth about your recommendations and how to carry them back to the Netherlands and implement them in the education of Dutch hunters. So not on every single topic I'd like to discuss now, but if that's an opening, Jesper and the team of Jesper and your colleagues, I'd like to stay in contact and do something with the work and recommendations you gave us in the Netherlands for goose hunting and behavior of hunters.
Thank you very much.
Okay?
Thank you very much. And then we actually have the first outcome of this meeting, that we are going to set up some sort of discussion, dissemination plan with you. Thank you very much.
That's a strong commitment from our side.
Sorry, if you can keep the remaining questions for the final discussion. I think that we have to move on. I've gone over my time already. So thank you very much for your interest, and I'll pass on the floor to Kevin.
Thank you. Am I clear? Perfect. And can anyone give me a heads up that this looks all right on your screen?
It looks good, Kevin.
Thank you. All right. I promised to give a brief introduction on how to monitor crippling and what we can do with that monitoring afterwards in terms of expressing our results. And I'm going to start off by a very brief introduction to the two different ways of monitoring that has been used in Denmark. And to the left here, we have the observational studies, which is often most conducted by assessing a ratio between killed and crippled birds, either by the hunters themselves and then by questionnaires, or by a field observer that is overlooking the hunt, as Jesper just talked about in his previous presentation. The other type of monitoring is the X-ray studies, where you collect a sample of either live or dead birds, and then you X-ray them for embedded shotgun pellets and express this as a percentage. And while these two different approaches are different in terms of methodology, they're also different in terms of what they measure. And the observational studies to the left here, in order to actually acknowledge or to recognize a crippling event during a hunt, that crippling will have to be quite severe. So either a bird losing height or actually falling down within a couple of minutes after the shot has been fired. That will, in most cases, result in the birds actually dying or at least being seriously crippled. So that's what can be measured from these observational studies. The X-ray studies, on the other hand, they take place much after the actual crippling event, usually half a year or so. And what these measure are the presence of the pellets, as Jesper rightly told you. So it's birds that have lived on, just to emphasize that, with pellets, and they might then be slightly crippled or maybe have no effect of carrying them. So they measure different things, these two methods. And in terms of reliability of the data, these observational studies are sometimes really hard to conduct. There's some subjectivity, and also it's just simply difficult to assess whether a bird is crippled from a shotgun being fired or not. It is, however, possible to have a measure of performance that is quite easy to measure from these observational studies simply by calculating or by counting the number of shots being fired per delivered goose. The X-rays, on the other hand, I would say data collection is easier. It's still cumbersome, of course, but at least it's more scientific, and you can compare different samples in space and time with each other to compare the percentage of birds with embedded shotgun pellets on a very objective scientific way. And this will be the focus of the talk from here on, because this is simply where most of the work has been done, both in Denmark and beyond. In order to get birds or animals to X-ray, you need to first collect a sample, and there are different ways of doing that. One way is to harvest birds by different means. That can be by the use of BB shotgun pellets, which are pellets with a diameter that are larger than is allowed for regular hunting, or by shooting birds with rifles that does not leave pellets in them, of course. And the picture to the right here actually shows a goose that has been killed with these BB shotgun pellets. That's the ones marked in red. They have a very large diameter compared to the other pellets. And then we can also acknowledge that there are 2 embedded pellets here marked with yellow that are slightly smaller, and 6 pellets that are smaller, again marked with white. So this goose has actually been subject to 2 crippling events prior to being shot with the BB shotgun pellets. And they might, of course, be from the same hunting event if 2 shots were fired, but they may also come from different hunting events. Besides BB shotgun pellets and rifles, one can also use roadkills. That's not ideal for geese, I'm sure, but there's a lot of other animals like foxes, deer, where that can actually be used to collect the sample. And then finally, what is most often used is a capture of live animals which can be by means of drop nets, cannon nets, rounding up molting birds, etc. No matter what type of sampling you engage in, you should always be aware that there's no bias in the method. And when I say that, then it's because whether we talk about BB pellets, roadkills, or capturing birds, we sort of assume that there's the same probability of sampling crippled and non-crippled birds. And that may not always be the case, of course. One could think that previously crippled birds have a lower tendency to go down at decoys, or even a higher tendency because they are crippled. One could also envisage that crippled foxes would scavenge more than non-crippled foxes and then be more prone to be run over by cars. And finally, when capturing geese, this is sometimes done by baiting an area. And you would also imagine that if you are severely crippled, then that would be an easy source of food compared to an individual that is fully fit. Irrespective of the method used, one should always aim for a representative sample. And that is both with respect to the age classes that might be present in the population, the sex classes, and then also be aware of geographical differences that might exist on several scales. This is a capture of rent geese in Denmark. And as you can see, they're wandering around on this salt marsh here. And of course, we have to make the assumption that this is a random selection of birds. And for one thing, this area is baited. So as I told you before, it might be preferred if you're crippled and need an easy source of food. And for another thing, it's also been shown that something like family groups sometimes dominate these areas with very good quality food. So family groups might actually be overrepresented in this sample compared to the population as a whole. And now, even within this group, we subsample in a minute here when the net fires, because there are now 70 birds on the meadow. And as you see here, we catch around 17, if I remember correctly. So we actually also assume that these 17 birds that were the last ones to get out of the way when the net was fired is still a representative sample. But that's what we have to live with. And then at least we should be aware that there might be limitations to this. On the regional differences, this is just a very clear case to prove my point. And this is on tiger bean geese in Denmark. We have in Denmark two major stopover or wintering sites for the central management unit of the tiger bean geese. One of them is in the southeastern parts, down on Lolland and Falster, and one is in the north in an area called Lille Vildmose. Now, the issue here is that actually in Denmark, we have an open season on bean geese down here in the southern parts, whereas the season is closed in the north. And that has to do with tundra bean geese being present in the south as well. Nonetheless, you can imagine that if you take your sample in any one of these areas, then you will be highly biased towards either a higher crippling or a lower crippling, depending on where you take it. So of course, one should always be aware of such differences and then sample equally in both sites. These geographical differences might also occur on larger scales. This green line here is drawn to indicate the major migratory route of Russian Arctic breeding barnacle geese. And if you conduct a sample to X-ray on the Arctic breeding grounds, let's say on Kolgurup Island, for instance, then you're pretty sure that these are Arctic breeders, of course. But if you take a similar sample down in the Netherlands in wintertime, then these are highly likely to mix up with the growing resident population of barnacle geese in that area, which may, of course, have had very different histories in terms of being subject to hunting. So again, this is just to keep in mind that where you sample is important in terms of what you can infer from your results. And I think Sander will get back to this briefly in his talk as well. For the remainder of this talk, I will again get back to the pink-footed geese. And the way we've monitored pink-footed geese to make the sample most representative is to capture birds at times and at localities where the entire population is confined to a very small area. And up until 10, 15 years ago, that was in the west coast of Denmark during spring. But in recent years, the captures and the X-raying has taken place here in mid-Norway, in Nord-Trøndelag, where the entire population, except the ones going over Sweden and Finland, stop over on spring migration in a very small area. Assuming that we have a sample of birds and that they've been X-rayed, we can then express the crippling rate as the very simple measure that is the number of birds with pellets divided with the number of birds X-rayed. And what that tells us is the percentage of birds. It can be either a specific age group or combined that have pellets in the given sample. If furthermore that sample is large and representative, we might then infer that this is also the proportion with pellets in the entire population. And as such, the crippling rate is a very good measure for what we can call the population impact or the population welfare in terms of crippling. There are things affecting the crippling rate though, and one of those things is the age of the sampled birds. And this shows the juvenile first winter birds to the left and the adult birds to the right, and the crippling rate of both groups. If we start on the left side, we know that these first winter birds have only experienced one winter, that is one hunting season. So what they give you is the current picture, the picture of here and now, and it can also be used to infer annual immediate differences. While that is of course lovely, it also comes with a cost because juveniles often come in very low sample sizes, and at least in some years the juvenile ratio of the caught flocks is very low, and therefore we have very low sample sizes and a large uncertainty on these estimates. On the other hand, the adult birds, we usually have a larger sample, but we know nothing more of these birds than they've experienced at least 2 hunting seasons, some of them maybe even 15 or 20. So there's sort of a cumulative effect of the pellets in these birds. They are an integrated measure, one could say, covering several seasons and birds of varying age. So they cannot give you an immediate change from year to year if hunting practices is improved or worsened. You can, however, with very basic statistics, calculate what the trajectory from any given point would be if you reduced crippling, like has been done here for 25, 50, 75, and so on, reductions in the crippling rate. So it's still useful. It just needs a bit more of calculation. Except the age of the birds, there's also an important effect of the sample size here. And basically, if we treat or if we divide birds into either having pellets or having no pellets, then we treat this as a binary variable. And binary variables can be very funny or can do funny things when sample sizes are small. And these 3 graphs are just meant to show you that. And these are simple coin tosses. We all know that when tossing a coin, the probability of a head should be 50%. But you can show here that if you only have a sample of 20 or 25, then sometimes you can actually get the result that the probability of head is 70%. In other cases, it might be 37%. So you need some sample, and we generally say more than 50 birds, preferably, to get at something you can say with certainty. And after 50 coin tosses, you see here that most of these graphs are down to the actual or the true probability of a 50% chance of heads. For social birds such as geese, swans, cranes, there's an additional challenge of the independence of single birds, especially when these come in family flocks. It's easy to imagine that the 2 individuals in a pair are not independent when it comes to the history of hunting they've experienced. But still, with these limitations, this 50 bird sample size of 50 should get you far. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the crippling rate and what might affect it. And I also want to touch upon its limitations, because the crippling rate was a good measure of the population impact, but actually it is a very poor measure of hunter performance. And the reason for that is that all else being equal, then when harvest increases, so will the crippling rate, simply because the more birds that are being shot at, the higher the percentage of birds with pellets. And if you imagine for a second that you have a hunter with a very stable performance of crippling 1 in 5 birds, then of course the number of birds that fly around with pellets will be directly proportional with how much this guy is hunting a given year. As a result, the crippling rate can only be a good measure of performance under the assumption of a constant harvest of the population. And that is very rarely the case, because changes or hunting season changes, or because of bag limits changes. And especially for these pink-footed goose, where we know that hunting is used as a management tool, we know that hunting changes over time. So we should not use crippling rate as a measure of how good hunters perform. And how might we get at that then? And the only way really is to somehow account for the level of harvest. And one way to do that is to calculate the harvest rate. And the harvest rate is a very simple measure. It's just the total harvest of a population divided by the population size prior to that harvest. Now, while this is simple to calculate, the data you need here might sometimes be troublesome to get at. The total population size you can get from total counts, or you can get from capture mark recapture analysis, while the total bag is something that you usually get from mandatory reports from hunters, as it is mandatory in some countries, but otherwise you will have to have an estimate of how much is being shot. If you have H ratios, both from the field and from the bag, that could be H ratio counts, and it could be from wing survey data, as is the case in Denmark, then you can actually split the harvest rate into juvenile and older birds. Fortunately, for the pink-footed geese, we have such data available, so we can actually calculate the harvest rate, and that's what's been done here. This shows the development in harvest rate from the mid-90s up until the most recent data for adults on the left and juveniles on the right. And what you see here is, for one thing, that both of them increase during this period. So we know for certain there's been a change in hunting pressure or in harvest rate. And hence, crippling rate should not be used as a measure of performance. And you can also see that juveniles are generally higher than adults, and that has to do with the higher proportional take of juveniles that Jesper also explained in his talk. Good. When we have the harvest rate, we can then define what we've coined as the crippling ratio. And the crippling ratio is the percentage of crippled birds in a population divided by the percentage of the population being shot. Or with the terminology that I've used so far, it's the crippling rate divided by the harvest rate. If defined as so, then the crippling ratio can be interpreted to say that for every goose delivered, how many others are then crippled as a result of hunting. And this accounts, of course, for the changes in harvest level that might be over time. We made a paper on this back in 2017 that we are, of course, happy to pass around if anyone's interested to look into this. But what does it do then in our interpretation of the data? The two graphs on the left here shows the crippling rate that has been shown previously, both in my talk as one of the first slides and by Jesper, from juveniles at the top and its adults in the bottom here. And the crippling rate sort of seems to indicate that there's a drop in the crippling around these late 90s, and then from 2000s onwards, it's really more or less stable. But as we've seen now, we know this has been during a time with an increased harvest of the population. So if we account for that and calculate the crippling ratio, we actually see that in terms of hunter performance, then the Danish and Norwegian hunters who are shooting at this population have improved consistently over time. And in terms of the magnitude of change, we can say that back in '97, there were actually 13 birds crippled per 10 birds killed, whereas in the most recent data, it's indicated that there's only 2 birds crippled per 10 birds killed. And the magnitude of change here is the same for the adults. So at least in Denmark and Norway, this is still a success story, although crippling rate has been constant in recent years. Yes, last slide, just to sum up. In order to assess crippling, what you first need to do is collect the sample, live or dead animals, for instance, by captures, by using rifles or by using BB shotgun pellets, and then you X-ray the birds. You should always, no matter what method you use, beware that the sample is representative, both in terms of demography and in terms of geography. It's then very easy to express the crippling rate as the percentage of birds with embedded pellets And we can also say that this is a good measure of population impacts. It tells you something about how many birds out there, or the proportion of birds that are affected by this. It is, however, a poor measure of hunter performance, simply because it's so reliant on how much hunting is taking place. As a consequence, if you are interested in the performance of the hunters, you should use the crippling ratio, which is simply the crippling rate divided by the harvest rate. And what this gives you is the number of crippled individuals per delivered birds. And while this is a good measure of performance, you do need to be aware that it requires reliable data, both on the population size and on the harvest of the population. And these might, at least in some areas and some cases, be very hard to get at. If you want to look at performance and you don't have these data available, then the alternative is to use these a bit more old school observational studies, but still it's rather easy to calculate a performance measure by looking at the number of shots fired per delivered goose. And as a rule of thumb, at least in the Nordic countries, we say that you should not use more than 3 shots on a single bird. So 3 shots per bird or less, that is an indication that you are doing all right. But we will come back to that, I am pretty sure. That was all for me. And I don't know if we have time for questions or not.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I can see there's quite a lot of activity on the chat.
Yes.
However, we are late. 6 minutes late. So
do we save them, or
I think we would ask you to save your questions, please, and then maybe some of the questions will be answered in the subsequent presentations. So I suggest that we move on and go to Sander's presentation. So please remember your questions. Sorry for that. Sander, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to share. Is this visible for everyone? Yes.
Yes.
I see some. Okay. Let me go back to the first slide, of course. Okay, thank you very much, Jesper, for inviting us to give a presentation on an ongoing monitoring project. It's still ongoing, as the title explains. We are still collecting a lot of data, and we are now sharing just some first numbers of the birds that we've already caught and measured with X-ray. My name is Moonen. I'm working at Wageningen Environmental Research, and together with colleagues from Soval NEO and Vogeltrekstation, which is the bird ringing station of the Netherlands, we are collecting a lot of, catching a lot of birds and ringing them, but also in the more recent years, we are X-raying them to see what's the amount of birds that have pellets in them. Short explanation of the content of my presentation, a short background information on why we started the crippling rate. As already a lot of this is explained by Jesper and Kevin, so I'm not going in too much detail on that. The field work, how we catch the birds and how we do the X-raying, the data that we collected, and some, at the end, I want to sum up some research possibilities that we're now thinking of that we could investigate with all this data that we collected. So the background, as Jesper already explained, of course, we have this large program, which in our case started off with barnacle geese. But it's the reason why we started with X-raying is that already quite a lot of people investigated birds, water birds, with X-raying and found tremendous high numbers of geese with pellets, which is of course worrying. And of course, you need to take this into account when looking at the population and possible effects of this pellets. So a few examples, like you see in this map, Jesper already explained that in Denmark they're doing a lot of work already for quite some years, starting in the 1990s. Maybe even earlier, I saw some few numbers. And also on the Buick ones and Whoopers ones, there is already done some work in the United Kingdom. And on the barnacle goose as well, by Jesper and Paul. And some work on mallards in France. And I guess there's not more research is done, but these are just to sum up that there is already some work done that shows that there is this crippling weight, which is really worthwhile to investigate also in the Netherlands, and in the lands that hasn't been done up till now. Some further background is that we are now collecting data from all other countries, so not only the Netherlands, which we are catching the birds, but we have found that, for example, Jesper, but also Nicholas from Sweden, Nicholas Liljebeck, has found it prepared to share their data with us, and we are now making a large database which consists of all the X-ray birds in all these countries you see on the map, so Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, few birds of Lithuania, and Sweden and Norway. And we hope that we can collect more of this from other countries as well to make a nice database which we can collaborate on. So we are not catching only barnacle geese, like I said. It started off with the barnacle geese because of this project, but we are also gathering data on other birds because we catch more water birds in other projects. So why not X-ray them as well? Because it can get very interesting results. So we're catching greater white-fronted geese, grey legs, some widgeons, mutons, very little, but we have two in the database until now, but we hope to include more, and barnacle geese. We catch them in various ways, like Kevin already told you, can catch them in multiple ways. One of the ways that we use is cannon netting. It's a very easy way to catch, for example, birds like barnacle geese that are always foraging in large groups and very tight to each other. So in one catch, and if you're lucky, you can catch quite a lot of them. Kevin told that he sometimes uses bait to lure them, and of course we do it as well, but mainly we do it without bait, and we only use a few plastic decoys, as you see in this picture where the cannons are shooting. The first three birds look very quiet, but these are plastic birds, so they won't fly away. But also we use this method for widgeons and brancoos, also for the swans. So it's a very effective way of catching birds. But another very effective way in which you can catch very large numbers is molting catching. Like you see on the left picture, we do that in the Netherlands on the resident barnacle geese population, which breeds in the Netherlands. When we can catch a few hundreds at the same time. Of course, we can't ring them all in all these hundreds of birds in one ring because it takes too much time. So we select a few out of this, and mostly the birds that are already ringed, you of course X-ray again to see if they retrieve pellets in the last year. And as you can see, sometimes we try to keep the geese quiet in a very creative way by laying down in the fen with them. I'm not sure if it's really helping, but. And the last method that we are using, or not we ourselves are using, but some traditional people that are already catching geese for many years. There are still 5 so-called huts with people that are catching geese in this way, which use live decoys. So on the left side of this frame, you see a few geese, which are the live decoys of the goose catcher. And on the right side, you see a few, I think there are 5 wild geese. And it's a short movie, so I will show how it works. So these wild geese landed on the right side of the decoy bird, and they walked towards the decoy birds, and then if they are in range, the goose catcher is able to pull a rope, which releases the net, and if you're lucky, you catch them all. And in this occasion, indeed, all 5 birds were caught. It's of course a very nice way. It works very well, especially for great white-fronted geese. But you can imagine that the decoy, taking care of decoy birds and the way that they catch is very time expensive. So we are very lucky with these 5 groups of people that are still catching in this old way, or this traditional way. Of course, then when we caught the birds, we need to X-ray them. You already saw a few pictures of Jesper, which uses a similar type of method. And on the right picture below, you see Nicholas Lillebeck of Sweden, which has a similar X-raying device, which is very mobile, so we can bring it along during the catching, which allows us to catch everywhere in the Netherlands and where it's allowed to use this X-ray. Again, a few pictures like Jesper already shown, and Kevin also. And we define the crippling as a bird that has at least 1 or more pellets embedded in a tissue. Ingested fragments, so sometimes you see that geese have ingested metal parts, but mostly they don't look as round as pellets. And if this is the case, we exclude them from this X-ray. So that's not counted as crippling, but it's just the effect of ingestion of metal parts. But these are excluded from the database. So some numbers. We have, as you can see, we got quite a range of species. The main focus was on barnacle geese, so that the load of numbers is also in the barnacle goose. And as you can see in barnacle goose, you see particularly high numbers in the Netherlands and in Denmark. You have to see that in Denmark there was only 1 catching moment, so that's a bit less accurate as the Netherlands, where we had 22 moments of catching, and the percentage was 17%. But if you look, for example, at the Buick swans, which was of course only 1 catching moment, but the percentage was very high, almost 46%. And these numbers are all relatively realistic. If you look at Kevin's presentation, you need at least around 50 to be somewhat accurate. Of course, not all of them are. You can see that for the whooper swan, we have only 2 birds, which gives a percentage of 0, but that's too low number, of course. So we hope to collect more whooper swans in the future. And if you then take these birds or all this data into a graph and look at crippling rates on the y-axis and set it up to body mass of each of these birds, you see that heavier birds are carrying more pellets. This could be, of course, of 2 reasons. One reason could be that heavier birds means that they are a larger body, so maybe it could be that if they are shot, they are more capable of handling these pellets, so they are not easily killed. But another option is, of course, that Buick swans are getting older than widgeons, and they have more time to sort of collect pellets. That's an interesting result. To compare our results with some data from the past, knew that all in 2011 published data on Buick swans as well. And as you can see, also in this research, numbers were fairly high. In the 1970s, it was around 34%, and in the 2000s, for example, it was 22%. But they also found out that a significant increase of pellet with increasing age of the birds. And in our catching moment, we of course, like Kevin like Kevin told us, we catch just a random sample of the birds, but in this case we caught only 2 juveniles. And this could mean that this 45% is a little bit caused by the fact that we catch mostly older birds, which from the research of New et al. Have more pellets in them. But still, it will be very high if we caught more juveniles. Pink-footed goose, Jesper collected, as he told, still some data of pink-footed goose in Norway. And of course, he told already about the numbers in the years 1997 until 2005. And as you can see, the decrease, which was maybe caused by the fact that they started up this program. And in 2017, he collected 3 more catches. And in general, if you take all juveniles and adults, the percentage is 15.3%, which is still lower than, for example, 1997. So maybe there is still some effect of this program, but it didn't reduce much further after 2005. Then looking at barnacle geese, Jesper also caught some barnacle geese in the years 2009 and 2011 with his colleagues. In general, the proportion of barnacle geese looking at both adults and juveniles was 12.46%, which is somewhat in between the other numbers that we found. In Denmark, for example, it was 18%, which was found by Jesper as well. However, if you look at, for example, Germany, we did 3 catches and with quite a lot of barnacle geese, almost 270. We found only a percentage of 7.8%. And it is the case that in Germany, barnacle geese are not allowed to be hunted only in a region where we didn't catch. So maybe the fact that in Denmark and the Netherlands the numbers are much higher is caused by the fact that they are hunted there. A bit more detail on the barnacle geese, because that was our main focus, of course. In the Netherlands, we caught in 5 provinces. As you can see, the most catches were in Friesland and in Zuid-Holland. And we did 3 catches, of which 1 was in Limburg, 1 was in Utrecht, and 1 was in Zeeland. We know that in the Netherlands we have a breeding population, which we caught mainly in Zeeland and in Zuid-Holland, which was in summer, in July, so we're definitely sure that these geese are staying within the Netherlands. And as you can see, in Zuid-Holland, the percentage was very high. It was 20%. In Zeeland, it was a bit lower, only 8%, or about 8%. But what does it mean? We are investigating 2 sort of populations. The wintering population consists of both the summer birds and the winter birds, which arrive in winter. And this population is, of course, lots and lots higher. It's almost 1.4 million. And I guess in 2021, it would be a little bit higher even. And if you compare that to the population, which is in the Netherlands in summer, it's only about 54,000 in 2020, which will be a little bit higher in 2021, likely. So the numbers that we see, for example, in Zuid-Holland, is it caused by the fact that it is more hunting pressure in this area? Or is it caused by the fact that it's a very small population? Small, it's still high, but smaller. And does it show the fact that a group that has the same hunting pressure as in the winter, so in the summer they also, so these 50,000 birds are hunted at the same level, it's likely that of these 50,000 birds there are more shot because they are hunted for a longer period. And of course, it would be very nice in this case to do this, calculate the crippling ratio, which was very nicely explained by Kevin. However, as he also explained, it's very difficult if you don't have all the numbers. And of course, for the winter population, we do not know what happens in, for example, a country like Russia. And also in the Netherlands, we are not sure on all the numbers. We have quite some numbers, but it would be very good to have the most accurate numbers. And maybe it should be calculated in terms of provinces, because as you look at the two summer population catches or X-ray moments in Zeeland and Zuid-Holland, you see that in Zeeland the percentage was only 8%, about 7.5%, and in Zuid-Holland it was 20%. So it could mean that this reflects that in Zeeland there was much lower hunting than in Zuid-Holland, but we're not sure about this. So that could only be calculated if we have the numbers as correct as possible. Some research possibilities. An estimation of the total number of geese with embedded pellets. This requires, like I just explained, information of all countries along the migration routes, such as, for example, Russia, of which we do not know how much geese are hunted. Another possibility is to calculate to investigate possible influence of embedded pellets on body conditions. Jesper already did this on pink-footed goose and didn't find an influence. However, it would be very interesting to do this in other species as well, and maybe continue this in pink-footed geese as well. And another question would be, do number of pellets increase with age? It was investigated by Moonen et al. In 2011, and they found, like I told in the Buick farms, that indeed the older birds contain more pellets. And it would be very interesting to see if that's the case in other bird species as well. Not only looking at geese, we could also look at birds of prey. Possible effects of birds of prey, such as the white-tailed eagle eating for geese and other species with embedded lead pellets, could cause an increased death of white-tailed eagle, as lead ingestion could mean death for a white-tailed eagle. And of course, the most important maybe would be, how can we decrease the number of geese and other species with embedded pellets? Because I think all of us would agree that this is not what we would prefer, all these pellets within the geese and in the end in the environment. Like Jesper already also told, it's a lot of teamwork, so these are only 2 pictures, but we could have made, I think, hundreds of pictures with all kinds of teams consisting of many people, which I'm very thankful for, that they helped me out during this research. Thanks for your attention. I'm not sure if there's room for questions, Jesper.
Thank you very much, Sander. I think I'd prefer that we save the questions and go straight to Ove Martin, so that we'll take all the questions after his presentation. So if you don't mind, Ove, I would give the floor to you. And sorry to the audience that there's not time to do any question round now.
I need Sander to unshare his screen.
Yes.
I just did that. I'm not sure it's
okay. Now it's okay. So, do you see my screen?
Yes.
But now I can't see myself. Shall we see what happened there? Wait. Oh, there we are. Okay, I will actually start where Sander stopped. To reduce crippling, actually, we should have more practical courses on how to hunt, what you're hunting. So I will talk about practical courses of effective goose shooting and the avoidance of crippling. So just wait 2 seconds. So my name is Ove Martin Gundersen, and I work with the Norwegian Farmers Union. I've been running what we call in Norway the Goose project now for 7 years, and that's financed through the government. And we work with geese to implement international plans locally and so on and so on. But anyway, now I can't seem to. You guys been talking about the crippling rate, so I want to show you, to start with a picture, how that crippling looks when you shoot a goose. This goose is shot with a rifle. The X-ray picture is just a dummy picture. But when you open a goose after it's shot with a rifle and you go in the breast muscles of them, you can find those pellets embedded in them. So now we know how these look inside the body. So if you see the ring here, that's basically the same area where that shot sits. So these are the vital areas on a bird to shoot. Sorry, it's on Norwegian, but I forgot to change that language. But the red here is the vital organs where you need to hit the bird, that it dies. And remember, a lot of birds are shot flying. And when birds are flying, they are moving. So it's easy to cripple them if you shoot on a long distance. But this is just to indicate the lethal areas on a bird, how to get it down so you can catch it. But hunting geese happens in inhabited areas. There are more hunters in small areas. And when you hunt geese, you have to consider other outdoors activities, because basically in Norway, Denmark, and especially Sweden, where we hunt geese as a part of the hunting season, that hunting is around other activities. And it's a time where the farmers harvest, and that's what the goose hunter has to consider: safety, security, and everything. But I saw just one question I will just answer. Someone talked about multi-shot shotguns. In Norway and Denmark, it's not allowed to use that. It's only allowed to use 2 shots per gun. So if you have a pump action or a semi-automatic, it has to be plumbed. In Sweden, you're allowed to have 3. In England and other countries, I don't know. But if you have more shots than that, yes, I will think you will increase the crippling by firing rate when the birds are flying. So what should we expect from today's goose hunters? We should accept that they practice, but do they? That they know their limitations, that they use decoys when hunting with a shotgun. As Jesper talked earlier about here, of shooting them when they're flying by from the roost sites, that will increase the crippling rate pretty much. I'm quite sure of that. They need to think about animal welfare. That's very important to any hunting, and especially in the Nordic countries now, to be aware about that. Especially that focus on reducing crippling has been very important last years, especially on goose and on those big animals, big game, that has always been a focus. But how could we reduce the crippling rate? We can reduce the crippling rate by having hunting courses. That courses should focus on the species you hunt. Generally on small game, you take a hunting license and you can go out hunting. If it's a black grouse, capercaillie, or ducks, or pigeon, the training systems are basically the same on clay pigeon training. So in Norway, my project have made a hunting course for the Norwegian Hunters and Anglers Association. So I have a course every year and educate instructors to have courses around the country. So we have one hunting course that is about hunting in farmland. And we have another one, the development, that hunting around the coast side. And you probably wonder what different there is, but along the coast in Norway, many people hunt them with a rifle. So it's a quite different hunt than when you hunt them on the farmland, those big migrating flocks. So that course includes the biology of different gooses, the species, how management, the search for the optimal hunt that Jesper talked about, that Gitte had her PhD in, and we explain why we want people to hunt in this way with decoys. Forms of hunting, camouflage, how to use the decoys, and of course, in the end, we have developed a clay pigeon shooting course that I will tell you more about a bit later. But when you hunt with goose hunting is very variable. So you can hunt them with a rifle, you can hunt them with a shotgun. And maybe not everybody knows the difference, but a rifle, you have one bullet, and with shotguns, you have multiple pellets. That's the difference. And a shotgun is made for shooting on moving targets. It's not an accurate weapon. It's not a targeting weapon. It's made for shooting on moving targets at a close range. A rifle is a precision weapon where you can shoot at long distances. I will say the goose world ends at 300 meters with the right caliber on a rifle. but basically between 100 to 300 meters. And that's an accurate weapon. So when you hunt with a rifle, you use one bullet to hit the target. And this is the area you should aim at them. And then you're in the lethal zone, and the bird will lay there. The risk of crippling is very, very low. But some people hunt them with full metal jackets, as you see on the left here, then you will have a small hole. So if you don't hit that lethal zone, you will cripple them, they will die. So my advice is to use a hollow bullet for those who knows about that. But anyway, shotgun shells are basically a lot of small bullets inside the cartridge. And sorry, this is in Norwegian, but the red outline there is for the geese. And for people who know about different sizes in shotgun pellets, we call them US 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So in steel, that is most common in Europe, the number on the cartridge should be 2 or BB, as they call it. But if you want to know more about that, you can ask me later. Hunting geese are very varied how to hunt them. You can hunt them with a rifle at a long distance. You can sneak up on them, use the terrain and sneak up with them with a rifle or a shotgun. Or you can be in the stumble fields hunting them with decoys, or you can sit by the shoreline shooting them, passing over you when they're going up from the shoreline, coming down from the feeding areas in the morning. So the variety of goose hunting are actually quite much bigger than many other types of small game hunting. But what we're going to talk about in the course when we have is hunting geese with decoys. And when you hunt with decoys, you use those plastic birds that Sander and them use to attract the geese to x-ray them. But you also use a layout blind that you see on the top here, and you can use a hay blind, or you can use camouflage net. But the trick is you use those decoys to lure the birds. So the purpose of the decoys is to get the geese close into shooting range. And you use wind and you use the landscape as your guide. So in the blue arrows here is the wind direction. So you put up the decoys as you see the geese sit on the fields. And then you try to mimic and use what geese likes to be in the safe zone. So here you try to make a setup that attracts the birds, and the birds want to go in the middle. And then you get those small holes here that you want the birds to land. That's what we call the kill hole. And when you set up the decoys, you can actually decide how long you want them from you. So normally we advise people to put them on 25 meters, as Jesper said, on the shooting distance. So when the birds are in between the decoys, you know always they are in range of the deadly zone with a shotgun. This is the same picture, but the point is you have to lure the geese to come in the middle of the picture between the red arrows. The blue arrows are actually just the wind direction, and birds will tend to land against the wind. So this is how we want to have them. They will come very close. Most geese shot over the decoys are shot between 10 and 15 meters, I will say. The risk of crippling them is very little. And most hunters who hunt with decoys, especially in Norway and Denmark, I know they have a competition in using as less shots as possible. So many hunting teams, they use actually around 1.5 shots per bird, actually, many of those keeping track of it. But the distance assessment, that's what hunters need to train on. If you see on the picture on the right side, my left side of my picture, there is a goose high up. That's probably too high to shoot them. When you shoot them flying over you, it's very difficult to see if it's 25 or 35 meters actually. But using decoys, you will always see how close they are. And what hunters should do is actually test their guns and ammunition. I will talk a bit more about that later to avoid the crippling. And when you talked, I saw a question about multi-shotguns and everything, that many hunters tend to shoot more shots than they need if they have that when it comes in those flocks. And when we have the courses, before we started the shooting courses, when you have new hunters on the field and you say, are ready to shoot, they pop up and shoot. So that's why I don't shoot for just shooting. And you should not use more than 3 shots per bird. That's then average what the Nordic Hunting Association says for all bird hunting. So that goes for pigeons, capercaillie. But I will say if you use decoys, you shouldn't use more than 2 actually. But this is the average on all bird hunting. And do not shoot in the middle of the flock, because that's also one problem that people tend to do when it comes a lot of geese against you. They are not trained enough to focus on one bird at a time. So I'm going to show you a video of how that can look when the flock comes in. You need to take the birds that are outside of the flocks. So before you go out hunting, you should actually test your shotgun shots. Most hunters don't. I will probably say that they don't, because if you have 2 types of shotguns, if you own 2 shotguns and you use the same shotgun shell, the same bullet size inside them, the spread will be different on them. And you have difference of shocks and everything. I'm not going to talk about that. But if you see the picture in the middle there, that's shot in 20 meters. And if you see the one on the far right, that's the same shot on 36 meters. And what you see on this picture is that when you shoot with a shotgun is made for shooting at short range, up to 25 meters, as Jesper said earlier. And when the bullets travel from the shotgun, they will spread more and more and more, and they will actually lose their power. So if the hunters shoot on a far distance, like 36 meters, you see how spread the shotgun pellets are, and they will also lose their power. So that's probably when you get the crippling, that people shoot on a bit far distance, and you have some pellets who have just enough power to penetrate the skin. And to penetrate the skin, a bullet needs to be faster than 80 meters per second. I think so. Sorry, I need to go back. So what we did is that we developed a practical course in effective shooting, how to train shooting with a shotgun when you're out hunting geese. And the focus and the goal with that course is that it should be easy to arrange. So this is a model of how to do it on basically every clay pigeon shooting field in Norway. Some shooting fields are more advanced, so you can do a bit better courses, but the point, it should be meaningful for the hunters who have normal shooting skills to test this. And my experience having courses in shooting like this is when the hunters go to that shooting course, before you take them out hunting, the new beginners, they actually shoot better after we started doing this, because they know what they go to. The goal is also primarily to give the hunter a self-insight in how their own shooting skills are. So what we mean with this, when we practice, if you sit behind a camouflage net in a bush or sitting shooting them, you should actually practice that way. The same way when you are at the clay pigeon field, sit the same way, shoot the same way. Because it's quite different to sit and shoot than standing and shooting like you do on sporting clay pigeon fields. So if you sit and shoot in a layout plan with decoys, you should actually train the same way at the clay pigeon ground. So that's what we have been doing now. So there is a hunter and anglers organization renting a hunting area where Gitte did her PhD now. So all hunters hunting with them has to take this course 2 times a year. If not, they're not allowed to go on that course, hunting actually. Hunting with a rifle is same but different. There you have to practice on being very accurate and have the right equipment, and you shoot on longer distances, and you have to consider safety precaution in a different way than a shotgun, because those bullets can travel long. But I'm not talking much about that, but you need the same. So we have a program for that as well. So the same way when you train with a rifle for hunting geese, you should actually try the rifle out in the field as well. You can lay on the field and target and target the target, but when you come out in nature, the ground is not flat, things are not what you used to, so you should actually practice laying on the ground there as well and target your gun. And basically you should hit the same hole every time you pull the trigger. at the distance that you want. And when you use a rifle, you need basically a scope and a turret on the scope. That means you can adjust the distance where the birds are. And you also need a rangefinder and a good binoculars. But that's with rifle shooting. But shooting is like exercising. And all hunting, even if you're hunting big game, small game, whatever, needs that you're a good shooter. To become a good shooter, the only thing you have to do is to shoot regularly. And preferably you should start before the hunting season. By the other hand, if you're too late, there is still no reason not to start. You should shoot as much as possible. And if you stop exercising, you will also end up like that. And this is the same with shooting. If you don't shoot on a regular basis, you will not be as good as shooting. Some people are naturally talented, of course, but so I created some tips for the hunters that they should know their visiting time. And with that, we mean that they should know when to hunt. If you're hunting them when they are flying or in the stubble fields or anything, for example, if you're shooting them when they're flying over, you shouldn't shoot on them on a day with no wind. I know the old guys in Denmark, they only hunt when it's very windy, if I understand correctly with the guys I know. And they never hunt if it's no wind and sunny clouds, because you get the geese lower. So that's what we know by know your visiting time and have several areas to hunt. With that, I mean that if you hunt in the same areas every day, you will scare the geese, they will be more wary, they will fly on a longer distance, and maybe that will make some hunters draw the line to shoot on a further distance. And give the geese peace. Optimally, you shouldn't hunt more than 3 or 4 days, we say, when you hunt with those decoys. But I will say the same for rifle shooting against the coast, around the coast. And after you started the hunting in the morning, you shouldn't hunt more than 3 or 4 hours after the first goose is shot, so they can come back in the area. What we see, if you hunt very much on those geese, they get very skeptical and they tend to circle. And maybe many hunters then would be a bit frustrated, and then they pop up when they think the birds are in the range and they shoot anyway. So, and what I told earlier, you should test your ammunition and you should practice your shooting. Wrong hunting will lead to crippling, and you should use decoys and calls hunting geese with a shotgun. Share experience and knowledge with other hunters and organize your hunting in your area. And you should collaborate with other huntings or hunting teams. And now I'm going to show you a short video about what this is in practice, the course, some goose hunting with rifle and some with shotgun. So to summary everything, that what we mean is that the hunters needs a realistic training program. And if you're a hunter and you hunt and you sit while you hunt, you should actually practice by sitting when you hunt. If you use a layout plan, you should actually practice from a layout plan. Same principle with a rifle. The use of decoys will reduce the risk of crippling when hunting with a shotgun. And use a retrieving dog. In Norway, it's not, you don't need to use a dog, but many hunters actually use a dog. Denmark, you have to. Sweden, I don't know, and the rest of Europe. And remember, a big part of that going on a hunting is actually not to pull the trigger. That is what actually will reduce crippling, to teach hunters when to shoot and not. So thank you for the attention. Can't hear you, Jesper.
Thank you very much, Ove Martin, for a very clear, instructive presentation. We have 10 minutes left, 11 minutes for questions. And Gitte, maybe you will try to moderate that, because you've been following the chat, I hope. And some of the questions have, I think, more or less already been answered by the presentation. So would you mind? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're down to the question from William from the Netherlands, and he asks if there are plans to combine measurements of crippling with measurements of stress hormone or cortisol in feathers of crippling and not crippling birds, to give insights into the long-term stress and welfare that crippled birds might experience.
Yes, I think I can answer that. No, there are not plans yet, but it's an interesting idea. And maybe it's worthwhile looking in the possibilities of if it's possible to do this and how we would implement this in our research. But thanks for the suggestion.
Okay, yeah. Then there is one more from Andres. He writes that the problem I see for the X-ray study is that birds accumulate pellets all along the migration route. So, of course, the longest time is spent in the wintering areas, but the hunting pressure during the migration is also quite intense, and it's hard to measure the proportion of impact.
Yes, that's a very good point. We would love to have small flags on the pellets so that we can see from which country they have been where they come from, but we don't have that. So I think we have to sort of see this as a communal responsibility, that the countries which have hunting seasons or allow derogation shooting of the populations, they need to see this as a shared responsibility. And of course, we should also address the main countries which are have the most hunting on the populations. But as you see from some of the presentations, in some cases we can pinpoint the main country in question, or the main province even in the Netherlands, and that means that we can target the campaigns more carefully. But apart from that, I think we have an issue here. Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'll just quickly go further, so hopefully we can get through all the questions. Teresa, he just had a comment to Sander, which I'll not go more into detail. It's just about the hunting in some of the provinces in the Netherlands. But then Eric Kemperman, he asked if, also to Sander, if hunters were involved in the research to deliver data in the Netherlands.
Yes, they were involved, but it's still work in progress. So I guess we need to collaborate more on this and see how we can pinpoint it. It's not the fact that I'm saying that they didn't work on this and that they didn't give us data, but we are curious if we could make this more pinpointed to different areas. So, but indeed, we need to collaborate with this with the hunters, of course. Yeah.
Okay, and then there's just one more comment to Sander, which seems to be a great opportunity to increase sample size by 32,000 geese a year. But yeah, definitely a good one as well.
Yes, I saw the comment and I wrote down all the contact information. So we looking into that. Thanks.
Perfect. And then there is one more from William, and he says that in addition to his previous question about decoys, Uwe Martin, he recommended the use of decoys and call in hunting to decrease crippling. And then he asked if the use of call and decoys are also recommended for the lethal scaring.
I don't know who to answer that. At least in Denmark, it is allowed for lethal scaring, so to say, or derogation shooting of barnacle geese in the autumn. So there's a possibility there. But apart from that, over.
In Norway, it's not allowed to use that for lethal scaring. If you have the permit to shoot geese in the springtime, it's not allowed to use anything that can lure them into the site. You have to take the goose and make damage. And you're not allowed to shoot many as you have in Europe. We can get maybe 1 or 2 and not pinkfeets. That's only gray lilacs. So it's very strict. No decoys or nothing, no sheds or anything on.
And I can see that Andres also replies that it's not legal in Latvia either. Okay, and time is running. Then we have one more from Niels Kanstrup. He writes that the EU bans lead shot in wetlands as from 2023, and asks if the research on crippling could be extended with monitoring of compliance. In other words, is it possible to tell lead from other shot in the monitoring of crippling rates? And I think Jesper, he answered something similar
Yes,
earlier.
I did that, but then we would have to sort of move to the way of monitoring that Kevin was proposing, using BB pellets or shoot them with rifle. Then we would possibly be able to dissect the pellets to look into the compliance. Yes, that would be an option.
Just a brief comment on that as well from me. In countries with wing surveys, one could actually, by very few means, X-ray the wings that come in anyway that we know are shot with shotguns, and then take out pellets from those. But of course, that is limited in terms of what countries can deliver to that.
Okay, and now move on to the last one as far as I can see, and that's from Brian Hein, who asks, must every hunter have a retrieving dog in Denmark, or can one team have one dog? So how many hunters can one dog retrieve for under the law?
Yeah, I'm not able to answer that, Kevin. Right?
Yeah, it is just one dog per party, so it doesn't matter whether you are 2 or 20 actually, but you need one dog in the party, and no further, as I recall, legal.
Is there a definition of a party?
Don't think so. So that is vaguely defined, but as long as you sit and shoot together, then one dog is enough. Okay. Maybe Niels can correct me even if he's still on.
Okay, yeah, just one more popped up from Eric. He says that in the Netherlands, the use of decoys, hunting area, periods and species, but also permissions to hunt after having taken compulsory precaution measures, such as chasing geese from the field, differ per province. And that complicates the situation and comparison of data, unfortunately. Okay, so that's not a question, but more a comment in general. Yeah, so there are no more questions on the chat. There's still 1 minute left, so if someone want to take the floor or have any additional question, we have a little time for that as well.
It doesn't seem to be the case, right?
No. And we hope.
In which case, I think on behalf of the presenters, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I think this has been really interesting to get feedback from you, and I hope that you have also got some take-home messages and inspiration for setting up schemes for monitoring or regulating hunting to reduce the crippling, which is one of the major objectives in our plans. So with these words, I would like to say thank you very much to all of you, and yeah, let's stay in contact. You're welcome to contact us. So enjoy your day. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.